Battlefield and Call of Duty are both
We are assaulting Charlie 1.
multiplayer, first-person shooters with similar settings and similar visual design, even with similar weapons. However, they feel very different to play. That feeling can vary quite a bit depending on the game modes for each game. So, for the sake of comparison, we're going to be picking Conquest for Battlefield and Team Deathmatch for Call of Duty. These are both quintessential game modes for each game series. They've been part of the game series for the last 15, 20 years, and they've been essentially the most popular game mode for each series throughout that time. Probably the most visually apparent difference is the scale. So the map sizes for Battlefield are much larger than Call of Duty, and that facilitates much larger player bases. So Battlefield typically has 64 players on a map, while Call of Duty typically has 12. And you can see that in the size of the maps. Favela is a typical map size for Call of Duty. They vary quite a bit, Nuketown being much smaller, and there are some larger ones as well. But Favela is a very typical one, and it's, as you can see, a couple of houses by a couple of houses. It's a couple of city blocks. While Caspian Border, again, Battlefield varies quite a bit in size, but Caspian Border is a typical map size, and you can see clearly that several favelas can fit into here very easily. It's much larger than just a couple of buildings side to side. Another noticeable difference are vehicles, some of which are used for traversal, like ATVs or jeeps, but many are combat vehicles, like tanks or aircraft, like helicopters or jets. Air vehicles, like helicopters and jets, are enabled by the scale. They simply cannot exist in a map as small as Favela or, God forbid, Nuketown. As for weapons, most of them are the same. You're going to have the same assault rifles, machine guns, shotguns, etc. I think some of the key differences here are the vehicle counters, rocket launchers, C4, anti-air missiles. I believe they all do exist in Call of Duty, but I think the use cases are different. The situations in which you use these are going to be very different. Some of the differences are sniper rifles. These are going to be enabled by scale. They do both obviously have sniper rifles. In fact, a lot of the snipers are the same, but the way that you use them are different, and I'm going to get into that in a second. And the last thing is that some of these vehicle counters will enable destruction. You know, when you use C4 in Call of Duty, you're going to be putting it in a corner and just camping and just waiting for someone to come over here. While when you use C4 in Battlefield, you're going to be putting that on a tank and running away and getting kills on that tank to stop it, because there's really no other counter to a tank. You're also going to be putting it on a wall, perhaps, and destroying a building that had a bunch of snipers in it. The weapons are largely the same, but the way you use a lot of them differ. Destruction is another really key concept in Battlefield, where structures can get destroyed, and so the cover that someone may have is not available all of a sudden. Something that isn't talked about enough about Battlefield is the concept of support, where each of the 4 classes in Battlefield can support the game through non-violent means. So the sniper can spot units, and that will show teammates where enemies are. And the sniper can hide a spawn beacon for squad mates to spawn behind enemy lines. The healer can, well, they can heal, they can even revive teammates, which is probably the most important one by far. The engineer can repair vehicles, and the machine gunner can provide ammo. Cool feature of Battlefield 5 is that the support class can actually repair broken structures, or it can create emplacements, or it can dig trenches, or other things that create cover for the team. It was a really neat innovation. And a fun fact is that in any game in the Battlefield series, you can reach the top of the scoreboard as a pacifist, because by fulfilling any of the support functions, you get points, and some of them, like
そこだ
healing,
気をつけ
can
ろ
get you a lot of points. And if you're in the right place at the right time, you can get a ton of points by healing a ton of people all at once, or by repairing vehicles, or spotting, or any of that. You can get so many points, and so you can actually get the top of the scoreboard without firing a single bullet. I'd argue the most important difference between Battlefield and Call of Duty is the spawning mechanics. In Battlefield, you can spawn on conquered objectives, vehicles, your squad mates, or a sniper's spawn beacon. Meanwhile, in Call of Duty, you spawn at random. There's a hidden algorithm that tries to spawn you as far away from opponents as possible. Nuketown is a great example of the effect this algorithm has. There's two houses on opposing sides. You spawn on one side, the enemy team spawns on the other side at the start of the battle. However, as the battle progresses, you're going to start spawning at random. You will sometimes spawn on the other house, which is in contrast to what you would intuitively expect. You would intuitively expect one team to hole up in one house, they'll occupy windows and shoot anybody trying to cross and create a sort of no man's land. I've frequently spawned in that supposed no man's land in Nuketown. Right in the middle, there's a corner between the cars, and the algorithm allows you to spawn there. Take a look at this footage I found of a YouTuber playing Call of Duty Team Deathmatch, link in the description below. He spawns on one side and then will respawn on the exact opposite side of the map and then spawns back all within 5 minutes. Now think about what effect that has on the flow of combat and the strategies it enables. So some common strategies that people might have in these games would be camping. So they can find a really good spot that has a great vantage point. I'm on one side in a house. I'm expecting people to come from the other side. So I can just sit at a window and just wait for people to come. The problem is that if someone can just spawn behind me, it ruins the entire strategy. It just ruins the whole point. And that's why you find that it's not that common. People will sometimes camp in a corner in Call of Duty, but it's very rare that it's done for more than 30 seconds because you will never know where people will come from. It's too unpredictable. It's not a long-term strategy. You're not holding off a point where it makes sense, as opposed to battlefields where you'll have an objective that needs to be conquered in a certain geographical area. There's oftentimes cover associated with that geographical area. You'll have people defending that point. They can spawn on that point. The enemy team spawns outside of that point. There's a sort of flow and direction to combat. And you can see that in this clip. On the grand scale in this map, the sides have changed. My side has conquered objectives on their side and vice versa. However, I'm spawning here on one objective adjacent to the next objective. And that means I know that the people behind me are going to be more of my team spawning behind me on C objective. And the enemy team is going to be spawning on B objective. And so on the grand map, yeah, sides have changed because, my team has captured E, which is their first objective, and they've captured A, which is our first objective. But at the end of the day, I know that I can go in one direction and face enemies in that direction, and that makes it so they can camp on the top of that hill with snipers trying to get me, and they'll know that they can do that safely without me randomly spawning behind them. It enables a strategy that is not possible in Call of Duty. By enabling a strategy, you also enable counter strategy, the classic being flanking, where someone is holed up trying to protect an objective. You now open up the opportunity to going around the person, which can be very time consuming, it can be very dangerous, it can be very slow. You're oftentimes stealthily walking over a long amount of time through dark corridors or whatever to just not be seen. And in a shooting game, you're not shooting anyone. You're taking about a minute to go around. But when you pull it off, it can be extremely rewarding because you planned ahead, you knew the environment, you used that to your advantage, and you're able to take your opponents by surprise. A key effect of these spawning mechanisms is the pacing. When you have a small map with randomized spawning that oftentimes will spawn you, right in front or right behind an enemy, you have very, very constant, fast pacing where you're just always action on screen. Meanwhile, with Battlefield, it's a little bit slower and a little bit more deliberate. You're spawning typically in a safe space. You do get to spawn on a squad mate, which may be in combat. So I think there's still mechanisms there that help ensure the pacing is still adequate, but there's definitely sort of more control there. So it's a little bit slower. Essentially, I think the key effect here is diversity in combat. In Battlefield, I can look down the scope for a long period of time, waiting for a target to show up like after positioning myself, and I can shoot them from a distance further away than the entire size of a lot of Call of Duty maps. Meanwhile, Call of Duty, when you use a sniper rifle, yeah, sometimes you can have a scope, but you're very rarely aiming down the scope for a long period of time because, again, you don't know if someone's going to spawn behind you or whatever. So oftentimes, sniper rifles in Call of Duty are used by quick scoping, where they will just run around the map, and as soon as they see
The
someone, they'll
enemy has
just
captured Delta Sector.
do, one shot
Take that
looking down the
objective.
sight very quickly,
This is point.
as opposed to in Battlefield, you can be camping out in the top of a hill, shooting for quite a bit, usually strategically to defend a point, and it's just an option that's just not available. You can absolutely run around Battlefield with a
Spotted
submachine gun
Ostalka.
and get a ton of
170
kills, just
meters
like you do
away.
in Call of Duty, but you don't have the option of hard scoping a rifle in Call of Duty, which you can do in Battlefield. So there's just more options, and
Our Delta
so
Bravo
there's
1
more
is under raid.
availability in the
They
combat
fully occupy
mechanics in
Charlie Sector.
Battlefield.
Enemy has taken
The
Delta
pieces of
Sector.
the combat puzzle that are in Battlefield but not Call of Duty include but are not limited to camping, flanking, use of vehicles,
All
use of
fixtures ready.
destruction,
Call in if you need me.
countering vehicles, and supporting teammates through nonviolent means. A lot of this varies by game mode. I would argue that the operations game mode in Battlefield is objectively better than Conquest because it does play around with some
The
of this,
enemy has taken
particularly the
Charlie Sector.
pacing. Call of Duty did introduce their own version of Conquest at one point, which helped introduce a lot of the different pieces of the combat puzzle. And Call of Duty Warzone operates entirely different, so that's a whole other point of comparison for a different video. Ultimately, I'd say these are the key differences, and they really help illustrate why small changes in game design can help make the feeling of a game so different when everything else ostensibly is the same.